email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Welcome back to part 2 of my conversation with Kip Knight, the founder of CMO Coaches, operating partner at Tom Vest Ventures, and author of the books Crafting Persuasion and Learn to Lead. We resume the conversation with a discussion about the key characteristics great leaders need to have.
Well, one of my favorite authors is a guy named Marcus Buckingham, and he wrote a book, it's probably at least a decade ago, called The One Thing You Need to Know. And he posed the question, are leaders born or made? And Clint, I guess I'll throw it back to you, and then I'll tell you what his answer was and what I believe. Do you think leaders are born or made?
I think there are probably some innate abilities that you're born with, but I think you can still be polished up, and I think there's some things you can learn along the way.
Okay.
So I'd say some born, but mostly made.
I agree, but I would even be more extreme. I think leaders, for the most part, are born, because the characteristic of a leader has two things that it doesn't matter which leader you're talking about. They are incredibly focused in terms of future state. In other words, they have the eye on the prize. And then they have this tenacity of just getting there, whatever it takes. And the final attribute they have is a sense of optimism, that they will figure it out, come hell or high water, they will figure out a way to get there. And his point is, you tend to be born with those traits in terms of, determination and focus and optimism. You don't go to a school of optimism. A lot of that is really, drilled into you by the time you're, 6 or 7 years old. It doesn't mean that you can't get better at all those things, but if you look at the truly great leaders out there, they exhibit those characteristics, and a lot of those are determined, early in life. Which, going back to the thing as a parent, that's why I think parents are so important, because you've got to establish those values early on, so that when they get to the point of being a leader, it's almost like part of their DNA. They've already been pre-programmed and they know what to do.
Yeah, I was never the smartest guy in the room when I was at Georgia Tech, getting my undergrad at Double E. But you weren't going to outwork me. You may have be smarter, but I was going to open and close a library, and I did pretty well academically because of that. Not because I was smart, but just I was stubborn.
Oh,
stubborn.
Amen, brother. I was exactly the same way. I knew there were plenty of, especially in some of the companies I worked on later on, like at Procter & Gamble or PepsiCo. They attracted the best and the brightest, but I would do whatever it took to get the job done. And, at the end of the day, I'd rather have somebody like that working for me than somebody who is phoning it in because they think they're so smart.
Yeah, I remember working on a project for a global company, and we had to pull a bunch of pieces of the plan together and get it all in the software, and it wasn't going very well. And so my boss said, well, I guess we'll have to go tomorrow and just tell them we can't have the final meeting. And I said, I'm talking to my boss. I said, that's just not an acceptable answer. So he said, what are you going to do? I said, I'll stay up all night. We'll get it done. And we did. Got the whole thing stitched together, and we were able to hold a meeting the next day. And thankfully we ended about noon, and I got to go home and go to bed.
Well, and that's probably one of your more favorable memories of your corporate career, I've got to think.
Yeah. And to his credit, he stayed up with me.
Well, that's great. But I think, to that point, if you can rise to the occasion, no matter what the odds are, and just show this confidence that, you will get it done, going back to your question about what makes a leader, that is absolutely what makes a leader, because when people are given up or they're depressed or they're, demoralized, to have, literally just one person light the candle in the darkness and say, okay, we're not done yet. Come on, let's go. Those are, frankly, and I would argue the whole situation in the UK started out that way. But we had a leader, Peter, who had a very clear vision of what he wanted to have accomplished, and we got excited by that, and we went after it. Margaret Mead's got another great quote. It's in the book. Frankly, she said, never underestimate what a small group of 6 or 7 people can do. In fact, all great revolutions have started with 6 or 7 people. So never underestimate the power of leadership and the ability of a small group of people to ignite some massive changes out there.
Right. So you had some other good advice in the book about regarding working as a part of a team and not to work with bozos. So, what was your take on that? What advice would you give regarding people when I think you actually described it as don't have a job, have something that you're passionate about doing and who you want to work with?
Well, I think you've got to have your own personal code of conduct and also your code of conduct in working with others. I remember one time we were working with the head of marketing for Lucasfilms when I was at PepsiCo. This guy was a, top-notch, ass. I mean, this guy was so full of himself. And I remember one time he was on a conference call and my boss asked a very, innocent question. And this guy just lit up and went berserk and started dropping the F-bombs and all that other good stuff. And Dwight, my boss at the time, I'll never forget it. I was really proud of him. He goes, Jim, when you can call us back and act like a mature adult and a professional, we'll continue this conversation. Until then, goodbye. And hung up. And this was in the middle of a big negotiation over, doing a tie-in with Star Wars. And there was millions of dollars at stake on the table. And, we could have lost the deal. But Dwight had a red line that if you crossed over it, he just was not going to deal with you. And again, for your listeners, I would say, there might come a time in professional conversations where you just have to call a timeout and say, we're done. I refuse to engage in this, and you're not going to have the power over me to treat me, with disrespect. And sure enough, 15 minutes, Jim called back and, mumbled an apology and calmed down and never did that again. But one other thing, and this is a theme throughout the book, one thing you'll learn about bullies is until you push back, they will absolutely try to dominate you. But the minute you push back, they'll go find somebody else to pick on. So don't put up with bullies and their kind of behavior.
Yeah, I think another thing you said I really liked was try to only work with people that you both like and respect. So I don't know, we don't always have that option, but.
Well, and it's also frankly going to, create your own brand reputation. I mean, if you're known for working with top-notch folks, high ethics, work hard, et cetera, that's what you want to be known for. You don't want to be known for the opposite. That's a kiss of death because you're literally going to be known by the company you keep.
Right. Yep. So let's shift over and talk about another virtue, and that's respect. And how do you define respect?
Well, I'd start with the word mutual. I think that you've got to both give and get respect. And it also goes back to what I mentioned earlier in terms of taking the time to understand where the other party is coming from. There's a reason people do what they do. The vast majority of humanity does not get up in the morning and go, I'm going to be a real jerk today, or I'm going to be a tyrant, or I'm going to be totally unreasonable. There's typically something that is driving that behavior, either going all the way back to their childhood or dealing with the current situation they're under, and you don't know. A lot of times you only get, half the information you need to really fully understand. So another one of my great bosses, Bill Cobb, had this great line, assume positive intent. If somebody's coming after you, rather than immediately, react negatively, just take a breath and a couple of, hey, I'm curious as to, are you okay? Or is there something going on that, want to talk about? Or maybe we don't want to have this meeting right now. Maybe we want to have a little bit later. So I'd say mutual understanding, mutual empathy leads to the ability to have respect because, again, it's a two-way street.
Yeah, I think the key word there for me was also mutual as well. I work on a lot of teams, and we really rely on the mutual respect among the team members to be successful. And I know that you have many stories you share in this section of the book around the importance of mutual respect when dealing with global teams. Is there any one or two that you want to share with us that really kind of drove home why the respect piece was so important?
Yeah, I would say recognition and respect go hand in hand. A lot of bosses think that there's a very limited amount of recognition or respect you can show an individual or party. That is so wrong. Most people are starving for that. And if you take the time, especially in a public setting, to show a little bit of recognition, which to me is the same as showing respect, it goes a long way. One of the things that I did when I ran various global teams is my wife's very good seamstress. And so remember Hamburger Helper, the little hand.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we came up with an idea that we thought would be kind of cute called the Helping Hand Award. And there was no money involved. But every quarter we'd have a meeting, and we had, probably 30 different countries involved. And any country could nominate another country for giving them a helping hand in terms of a problem they were working on or trying to solve. And Clint, I got to tell you, it was as if we were giving away $1 million bonuses. I mean, for a country to be given the Helping Hand Award was a big deal to them, and they loved it. It didn't cost anything other than some stuffing and some felt. So again, for your listeners, I would just challenge you guys to think, what are some ways in which I can show some recognition to either teams or individuals? The Brits have another great expression, praise in public, coach in private. And that is an absolute golden management principle because, again, if you want a team to really be united and focused and go through the tough times, if they know that there's some recognition along the way, never underestimate the power of that. It's incredible.
No, I couldn't agree more on that. It's one of my tenets as well is give credit in front of everybody else and then have the the hard conversations offline. No, it's just the two of you.
Absolutely.
Thinking about that as well, you part of the story was you were starting I think it's called a marketing university, and you couldn't really make them attend. And so you had to use, I think, this idea behind mutual respect and to entice them to make it from the way you put it, from more of a push to more of a pull. They actually wanted to participate. And so you had to do some things to get that going, right?
Yeah. In marketing, there's a principle called the Law of Scarcity. And so rather than just open it up and say, hey, anybody wants to come to this thing, let us know. We hand selected a number of thought leaders out there and had them come and made sure that they went back raving about how wonderful the experience was and all that. And so all of a sudden, instead of asking people, they were asking us, hey, could I get on the waiting list and all that other good stuff. So, again, for the listeners, what can you do with the Law of Scarcity to kind of make your product or service or whatever a little bit more special? Because if it feels like you're pushing it or trying to give it away, it just makes your job as a marketer that much harder.
Right. Now, I really like when you wrote, and I'm going to quote here, the respect and appreciation of folks you work with are some of the most powerful incentives in the business world. And I see the same thing in project teams where we rely on cross-functional team members really to support each other and hold each other accountable. Particularly important in matrix organizations where the team leader doesn't necessarily have any formal authority over the people on the team, and so they can't make them do it. And what are some suggestions you have to maybe some hints of how you can pull that off? How can you, when you don't actually control the people on the team, how can you still get them to do the right thing at the right time?
Well, I think I got trained in this early on at Procter & Gamble because P&G has a lot of shared services. And at the time, they had 100 brands. And so you had 100 brands going around trying to get these same services to help you out. And if you're on Tide or Pampers, well, right this way, sir. But if you worked on Spick and Span like I did, good luck. So you learn diplomatic skills early on. You learn how to be very humble and respectful and polite. And, if you say something, you follow up on it. And you try to figure out what could a win-win here be. I'll tell you a real quick story as to how I got into the video business there using this technique. So MTV was just coming out. That's how old I am. And I'd always enjoyed writing satirical songs. So one time I was watching Michael Jackson's Beat It and thought, boy, this would be an incredible video that we could have a little bit of fun with. And I wrote some lyrics called Meet It. And the whole idea was to meet your sales forecast. And And so I go to the photographics department and I tell them my idea, and they basically laughed me out of the room when I said I didn't have any money. And so about a month later, the head of the department was arrested for embezzling. And about a week after that, I called the acting head of the photographics department. I said, "Hey, you're very busy." And he goes, "Man, we got all caught leprosy. Nobody wants to touch us over here." And I repitched my idea about, "Hey, got this idea, and it would be great for your department to showcase some of your video techniques and photography skills and all that." And he said, "Well, we got nothing else to do. I guess we can do that." And read the book if you want to read the rest of it. But that started a whole series of videos that we did at Proctor, culminating in a Broadway musical that we did like 5 years later. That was pretty incredible. So just look for an opportunity for win-wins. And sometimes timing isn't quite right, but situations change. And if they do, go back and give it another go.
That's a great story. Can I look for the CD? Is it out yet on Amazon?
Oh, yeah.
Of all the, one of the things you also bring up in the book quite a few times, and I think it's you attribute it to Stephen Covey, but it's seek to understand, then to be understood. And this is such a powerful philosophy, particularly when you work with international teams. I mean, any team really, but certainly international teams. And I think it's kind of a underlying theme to a lot of what you talk about is, understand them before you try to push your own views across, right? Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a theme. It's a theme running through this entire conversation because, in fact, I've got another group that I'm coaching right now. It's a group of marketing leaders, and we've got a session coming up on negotiations. And if you think about any negotiation that you engage in, just making sure that at the end of the negotiation, both parties feel like they got a bit of what they wanted, and they also gave up some of the stuff they initially wanted. And the back and the forth and the bargaining. A lot of studies prove that both parties are going to feel a heck of a lot better about that outcome than if one party came in and put a gun to your head and made you say, "Okay, fine, we don't have a choice." So again, the theme runs throughout. What can you do to end up with a win-win philosophy where the other party, while they're not totally satisfied, they feel good about the process, and they feel good about the outcome, and they feel good about the relationship. And frankly, that's what makes business fun, and that's what makes negotiation fascinating, because if you can kind of work toward that end, it's terrific. And the more you hone those skills, frankly, the more successful you'll be in business. So I would encourage everybody to kind of think about, what can I do to really create a win-win outcome on whatever it is that you're dealing with right now. And it starts with understanding where the other side's coming from.
I like your definition of win-win. I had a boss once whose definition of win-win was he won and you lost.
Yeah.
That's how it was win-win for him, and that's not a pleasant experience.
I'm going to guess it's not your best boss either.
No, absolutely not. Go back to your comment about you learn from the bad bosses what not to do.
Yeah,
I learned quite a few stories there.
Yeah. And in terms of reputation, and there's a portion of the book at the very end. It's called 5 Questions That Great Managers Regularly Ask Their Employees. And I would really encourage, if you read the book, to go focus on those. And the very first question that I think a great manager should ask all their employees is, what does the company really appreciate about you, Clint? And that's a bit of a rhetorical question. But again, if a boss can make sure that it's a win-win in terms of your relationship with the boss, and here's what I respect about you, here's what makes you unique, here's what I'm counting on you to do, who wouldn't want to work for a boss like that, as opposed to a boss who has the philosophy of win-win means I win, you lose? I mean, you run, don't walk away from that kind of person.
Exactly. And none of this that you're talking about is free. It took some effort to turn the business around, but you saw some fantastic results when the project was over, when your effort was over. I think it was 8 times, eightfold increase in profits in just 3 or 4 years. Yeah, and I'd say that was an extraordinary win. And I've had my share of losses as well, but I would say that
the gold standard that I use for everything that I work on, I'm sure you're the same way, is did you give it everything you had? Did you give it your best shot? And did you do it in a way that your mom would be proud of you? Well, okay, if you could say yes to all of those, then even if it doesn't turn out to be an 8x increase in profits, you still can hold your head up.
Right. Now, this next passage I want to read, and then we'll close out with just 3 quick questions. But it's actually one of the reasons I started this podcast, and then so I want to read the passage in the book. And I really wish people would copy this and put it up on their wall and live by this. But listening is the foundation to creating mutual respect in any relationship. When you're having a conversation, rather than focusing on what you're going to say next, take the time to really listen and understand where the other person is coming from. And then you finish one of my favorite quotes. I use it all the time. And you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so we can listen twice as much as we speak. And so why do you think that's so important?
Well, when you go through coaching certification, which I did a couple of years ago before I started my coaching business, they have this course in what they call appreciative inquiry. And you can look it up online, and you can actually get books on there about leading with questions is the title of a great book. And the essence of this is to frame your conversations and your dialogue with questions like, hey, Clint, I'm curious as to why you started this podcast. And could you tell me what your big motivation was and why that was important to you? And so, in other words, rather than going and making a lot of assumptions as to why you did what you did, or making declarative statements as to why you should do what you should do, if you approach the other party with this open and non-judgmental attitude, people will open up and tell you things that, you frankly are sometimes shocked. And I learned this early on. One of my absolute heroes of all time in the business world is John Pepper, who is former CEO at Procter & Gamble. And John was, I think, one of the greatest listeners I've ever, had the privilege of being around, because when you were with John, he was so focused on what you were saying to the exclusion of any other distraction. I mean, it was like, and this is when I'm like a brand manager. He was like the CEO of the company who was like totally focused and listening to every word I'm telling him in a meeting. I'm a long way from being that good, but that's the goal that I've got, just to have people go, well, he's a really good listener. That would be high praise indeed.
Early on in the podcast series, I interviewed Allison Wood Brooks from Harvard Business School. And she had a term called boomerasking. And boomerasking is like a boomerang. It basically, I'm going to ask you a question only so it'll direct the attention back to me, so I can tell you what I want to say. Right. So we don't want any boomerasking.
Absolutely not.
All right. As we wrap up, I'm going to ask you 3 questions that I ask all of my guests. And sure. First one is, are there any leadership principles that speak to you personally and guide your day-to-day behaviors?
Yeah, I'll go back to Bill one more time. His mantra was disagree and commit. And again, for your listeners, I would encourage you guys to think about that if you're the leader. Businesses are not democracies. If you're in a business team, you're not going to take a vote and the majority is going to win. It's going to be the leader that says, okay, here's what we're going to go do. And to Bill, loyalty was the most important value. And it's a bit like the military. In the military, loyalty is absolutely sacred, because if you're going to go do something that's tough and maybe controversial, you've got to know that you are a united team that's going to persevere no matter what. So if Bill's attitude was, we're going to talk about it, we're going to discuss it, I'm going to listen to everybody, but once I make that decision and we leave this room, there's no second guessing, there's no Monday morning quarterbacking, and if I hear of any of that, there will be hell to pay. And people understood that was the way it worked. So again, if I had to put up one management principle that I think is absolutely key to getting stuff done, especially in tough environments, it would be disagree and commit.
I think I read somewhere that that's how the SEALs do it. When they come back from an operation, they leave the rank at the door when they have their debrief, and everybody gets to say 100% truthful what they think and what they feel. But in the end, when they leave the room, the rank goes back on, and it's clearly directed from the top down. There's no questions asked. Absolutely. What is the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
I had an uncle. He was a lawyer. It was the guy I was supposed to work for, according to my mom. But he had an expression that I really like, and it goes like this: always show the other person that you can be one of the nicest people they've ever met. But if they want to see what a son of a bitch looks like, you show them. So in other words, your first, move is always going to be polite, to be considerate, to be nice. My wife says my biggest flaw is I'm too nice, and maybe that's true, or I'm too trusting. But there comes a time, and you've mentioned, a former boss for years. I've had a couple as well, where if they trip the wire, it's a totally different personality, and you take the gloves off and you do whatever it takes to make sure that you don't get intimidated or bullied. So that would be something to think in mind. Always show them what a nice guy is, but if they want to see a son of a bitch, then you'll be the first one to demonstrate so.
I think that's really good advice. And finally, what is the best book or article you've read recently, and what was the key takeaway?
Well, I just finished reading Rise and Fall of the Third Rank. Frankly, the author's name escapes me, but the reason I remember it is the longest book I've ever read. It's like 1,700 pages. But again, going back to the history lessons there, I think that those that don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And, there are a number of things that if you study, what happened in, the 1920s and the early 1930s in Germany, which was a functioning democracy at the time, and you look at the parallels to today, it's pretty sobering. So, that would be a book that it's, and a different kind of book real quick, not to end on a total downer, but there is another book called Never Settle for Less. Again, it's by the former head FBI negotiator. And so if your listeners want to get a great practical book on negotiation techniques, highly recommend Never Settle for Less. Really good book.
Okay. Well, Kip, this has really been great. I really appreciate you coming on today and connecting with the listeners. If they want to connect with you and learn more, obviously they could buy your books on Amazon, but if they wanted to learn more about your coaching services or anything else, how can they do that?
Oh, easiest thing in the world is to just send me an email, Kip Knight, KIPKNIGHT, @CMOCoaches.com. They can also check out our website, CMOCoaches.com, and they can learn a lot more about what we do, both in terms of coaching as well as this thing called CMO Bootcamp, which is a lot of fun.
All right. Well, Kip, thanks for the conversation.
Thanks, Clint. It's been fun.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation. To find out more about Clint, go to ClintonMPaget.com and pick up Clint's book, How Teams Triumph, Managing by Commitment, at Amazon. The Conversation with Clinton M. Paget is a production of Forbes Books.